for it, ride for it. I'ma organize for it. Stay up in the night and in the morning I'ma rise for it. Heart for it, mind for it, ears for it, eyes for it. Peace and a place on this earth for me and mine for it. Work for it, ride for it. I'ma organize for it. Stay up in the night and in the morning I'ma rise for it. Heart for it, mind for it, ears for it, eyes for it. Peace and a place on this earth for me and mine for it.
So today we reached 102, I think, Patreon subscribers. We want to say thank you to everybody who's subscribing. That's like really humbling, and it is really affirming, and we're really excited to keep it pushing. So we're trying out a new format of some more casual episodes. So we're here with the whole squad. This is GP Jacob.
This is Isaac.
This is Kaylee.
Deanna.
Yes, we're really excited to have Kaylee with us. Actually, we're with Kaylee in Kaylee's home, and we're just kicking it. We're going to talk a bit. So to start with, Kaylee, could you kind of introduce yourself to the audience?
Yeah. Hi, everybody. My name is Kaylee. I feel like this is weird. I don't usually introduce myself in company like this.
I just wanted the host voice.
I know. I was like, wait a second. You can find me on Twitch at twitch.tv/Kswiftly. Many people probably know me as Kswiftly, but to friends and in good company, I'm just Kaylee. And I'm a lifelong Minneapolis resident. I grew up in South Minneapolis, and in the past year of my life have gotten into organizing work, courtesy of GP Jacob here. So, and several others who have really like galvanized me and been kind enough to sort of take me under their wing and bring me into the fold of organizing work and current events happening here in Minneapolis. So that's sort of how I'm coming to you today is sort of with the hat on of an organizer and also a fellow content creator.
What kind of organizing work have you done?
Yeah, I think like my passion for organizing really came out of a passion for environmental justice, which was something that I learned about and became passionate about in college, which is, I know, not always the best way to learn about things in the ivory walls of the institution of academia. But what I realized is that the concepts and things that I was learning, it wasn't just that I was in this ivory tower, like learning about these concepts. It was really just me building language to speak about the things that I had been experiencing my entire life. Mm-hmm. So environmental justice for sure, and then housing justice, and in particularly the intersection between the two. So the ways in which environmentalism and sustainability are now being commodified and turned into a selling point for new developments, and the ways in which new developments are being branded as ways to address environmental justice, but aren't necessarily doing that. So that's definitely how I came to the work. I think that like environmental housing justice for sure. More recently, though, becoming interested in labor organizing, obviously being here in Minneapolis, a lot of conversation about prison abolition, police abolition, and then sort of just like a larger recognition that all of these struggles are interconnected. And my goal as like an organizer is really to tie my struggle to others, to the struggles of others, to work forward communally and collectively towards a better future for us all. So.
Hell yeah.
Yeah. That made me feel good.
I was like, I think we're done. I think we just finished.
We can just call it quits now.
Yeah, it's like,
Yeah, I mean, I relate to being turned on in college because like MCTC kind of like made me aware of all these environmental risks that I was like surrounded with growing up in like Powderhorn neighborhood, and then like hearing about the green zones, and that made me aware of the Upper Harbor, which led me to Jake. That might be a good segue into
Hell yeah.
your next question.
What do you think about the Upper Harbor, Kaylee?
The Upper Harbor Terminal is being talked about by City Council, the mayor, the state legislators, as the development project of the decade. And the way that they're talking about this project is what they want for this project is for it to be, and I feel like I'm taking the words right from their mouths right now, but the model for equitable development, the gold standard of equitable development. But like failing to realize that equitable development is like an oxymoron, basically, in the first place. Not to mention that the ways that this process has unfolded has been like so toxic, so uninclusive, and in fact, quite frankly, disrespectful as hell to the community of North Minneapolis, who they claim are being deeply engaged in this process and just really aren't. And I really came to those meeting rooms. I came to those spaces originally from like through work, like through my job, but ended up really staying through a personal connection and a personal outrage that I was feeling over the way that this process has been unfolding. And so I think, to put it simply, I don't like the Upper Harbor Terminal. I have nothing against that space as a whole. I think that what they're trying to pull right now at Upper Harbor Terminal, they're talking about it being the development project of the decade, but what I really think it's going to end up being is I think it's the largest gentrification risk of the decade. I think it's going to be the cause of the largest amount of displacement in the decade. I don't think it's what they claim to be the goals of this project are not what I'm seeing unfold in this project in any way, shape, or form. So yeah, not a fan, to put it lightly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just remember one of the goals being on the website, like to emulate what happened in North Loop. And so if that's one of the goals, is to like create a very gentrified, like white only, almost white exclusive area that's like very upper class and luxury condo riddled. It's like, okay, so who is this for? Yeah.
No, that's a really great question. Who is it for? If you asked Councilmember Cunningham, if you asked the mayor, if you asked Jeremiah Ellison, if you asked any of the employees from CPED, they would say that this is for North Minneapolis, and that this project is a way to reconnect North Minneapolis to the river. Now, is there anything wrong with that sentiment? No, because in fact, the North Minneapolis should have access to the river. It is ridiculous that North Minneapolis is the only place in Minneapolis, North and Northeast really, where the riverfront property is not protected public land, and where they have private industry right on the waterfront, essentially cutting off access to that space. Not even to mention, like, geographically speaking, I-94 and like the other features that have been put in through racialized state development processes to separate the Black community of North Minneapolis from the river and really disinvest in that community overall for a long time. Not only just disinvest though, but also pollute that community through the industries that have been located there. So the sentiment is right. I agree with the sentiment. The frustration for me is that you cannot expect these outcomes in the larger context of what we're dealing with here. We're talking about a city that has put no substantive anti-displacement policy in practice yet. We're talking about a area of North Minneapolis, North Minneapolis that is the scene of some of the most aggressive speculation happening in the city. People are getting calls daily to sell their homes. We're talking about an area that was devastated during the housing market crash of 2008-2009, whose home ownership rates plummeted, whose land was plundered by white, out of city, out of state, sometimes even out of country property owners who came in, took advantage of the amount of land that was lost to that community, purchased that land, and is now renting much of that property back to that same community. We're talking about a community who is facing gentrification threats basically from all sides at this point, encroaching in from the western suburbs, encroaching in from the south with North Loop, and some of the things happening in those neighborhoods, in the near north and Harrison neighborhoods. We're talking about a project area that is on the radar of several different municipal bodies at this point. It's not just the city of Minneapolis. It's also the Parks Foundation with the River First projects. We're talking about the Above the Falls projects. We're talking about the watershed districts. We're talking about so there's just so many interacting groups right now, and it feels like, and what I've seen happen is the language that all of them use they all use the language of centering community, of social justice, of environmental justice, of housing justice, but none of their actions have reflected that. And I feel like, personally, a great frustration that I have is that this work, the work for a more environmentally just future, the work towards housing justice in these communities has been strong and rich and deep for a long time. And to see that work now being co-opted into local city and municipal government bodies, to me is just speaking to that larger idea of disrespect to the community. It just feels so disingenuous being in those spaces, and those spaces are so toxic to be in the first place as a community member, that the idea that somehow this project is going to end up serving community for me is just pretty outrageous. Sorry, that was a bit of a long.
Go ahead. Hell yeah. It's funny that they said the goals were the same as the North Loop, and it's literally the same players. Or if you look at the role of United Properties and the Paulette families in the development of the North Loop, they were like some of the founding key players and most lucrative profiteers of like the gentrification of the warehouse district into the North Loop. So it's, to me, everything that you're saying, or a lot of it, the common thread is this like hijacking of language and just putting lipstick on a pig. Basically, they learn what are the buzzwords that will like touch a certain Democrat progressive brain and make them feel like they checked off the racial equity box, but then move forward with the same capitalist plans that are rooted in white supremacy and not used to even having enough community pressure in their insulated spaces to be called on the dissonance between the two. It's like usually they could just say those checkbox words and move forward.
Yeah, and to speak to that a little bit further, like, that's not by accident, right? Like, there is an entire industry that has been set up around co-opting racial justice language, other social justice languages. We're talking about, just thinking about the larger context here of what we're going through right now in Minneapolis. I know we've probably all seen the reading list going around about racial justice and anti-racism, and usually the number one book on that list is White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. Robin DiAngelo being a white woman who has been paid for about, I think, more than 20 years at this point to go into corporations, to go into government.
She went into the Trump presidency, right?
She sure did. Got paid over $8,000 to teach anti-racism to the. I know.
I think it was the
administration.
I think it was the Coast Guard.
Was it? Okay.
I think so.
I saw that I didn't do as much investigation as I would have liked to, but I did see that was a thing, that she's been paid in the years of the Trump presidency to do something for the government. And, it's not just Robin DiAngelo. We have local players that do this as well, who are, this is honestly a huge part of the nonprofit industrial complex. The racial justice trainings, the anti-racism trainings, the let's go in and teach people the language to start speaking about these issues. But what you unwittingly do in that process is teach them the language, teach them the ways in which they can use that language to further the very same status quo that the organizers and activists and grassroots folks on the ground have been trying to subvert this entire time. So it really, and once again, the nonprofit industrial complex just being a a capital-driven institution that ultimately like relies on money, capital, and capitalism to like further their work. And the expectation that like it'll just be that if you get the language in the right places, that'll somehow subvert the system. Like that's just really not enough, especially when in the process of adopting that language, you adopt that language in a way that suits your needs and really isn't challenging the things sort of at the base of all of this, which is capitalism and race and colonialism and the different systems at play here. You're not gonna be subverting colonialism, capitalism, and racism by teaching corporate America the language of anti-racist. You know what I mean? Like that's just, it's not enough. It's just not going to do it. So, I would not be surprised if some of the bigger players in Upper Harbor have been, part of these racial justice trainings.
Oh, they have.
Oh, certainly.
Yeah, we definitely have.
Yeah.
I'm not surprised. I mean, I know that the city does them. So
honestly, I've been in there with them, or in terms of that's a world that I have a foot in. Through like grassroots community organizing, have been a part of teams that have been contracted to come into institutions and do racial justice trainings. And I think it's everything that you said. And I think it's depends on how you exist in the space or how, because what's needed is popular education around racial justice, I think. And it's just like the idea of white people getting together to read books right now, there's like some merit in that and some value in that, but it really depends on which books you read and how you read them and in what context.
How do you process them?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think what you're saying, what I've seen is I'm thankful that I have mentors in the community that has integrity and hasn't gone down that will turn down money and turn down jobs and does that as a side hustle kind of, but is rooted in the actual community organizing work and are politicized. So in that sense, that gives me, I feel like, a ability to discern the way that racial, especially white racial justice practitioners or whatever. And it's really gross. It's really oppressive and appropriative. And it's part of capital's plan to like co-opt racial justice language and continue to repress and oppress. And I feel like that, to me, it is a great place to find some delineation between like a liberal approach to politics and to racial justice and then a working class left-wing approach, because it's the idea of, is your audience the management, and are you going to train management and elected officials better language, and are you going to expect there to be a technocratic solution that a few people on the top can implement? Or like another example, I feel like to counter Robin DiAngelo, I feel like people should study the work of Noel Ignatieff, and I might be saying his name wrong, but he was an anti-racist white man who was a scholar and wrote books and worked around racial justice, but he was a leftist and a working class person, and he took a different approach. And for most of his life, he was a factory worker. He didn't go to college. He tried to build left-wing, anti-racist, working class rank and file unionism in the factories. And then he went and became a scholar, and he wrote books with that audience and that experience in mind. He wrote the book like How the Irish Became White, that really breaks down the movement from an oppressed colonial population to the founding of the police force in the United States and some of the most violent enforcers of white supremacy. And he also edited a magazine called Race Trader Magazine, which was an abolitionist magazine, so that they were using that word abolition around the whole concept of whiteness and the white race, saying that whiteness is a legal category created for the purpose of installing white supremacist capitalism in America. It's unredeemable, and it's not permanent. It's not biological. It's a culture that's grown out of a certain moment that can be changed, in that we have deeper roots than America. You know what I'm saying? We all have, those of us who are white, we have lineages, and we have a future that could be outside of whiteness. And that's like a much more transgressive idea than like Robin DiAngelo or liberal anti-racism, which boils down to like, if we could just diversify the capitalist order, then things would be okay. And if white people just fix their bad personalities and bad socialization, then things will change, you know?
Yeah.
So, yeah, I feel you.
Yeah, that's funny that you bring that up, because I've been thinking a lot about and have been covering on my Twitch stream a lot, this concept of allyship, and particularly this idea of white allyship, which in and of itself is a bit of an oxymoron. And not to get too deep into it, but there are voices on Twitch who are very frustrated with my denouncing of allyship and the fact that I don't subscribe to the term allyship, because I think that allyship is part of this liberal this liberal politics that you're speaking of, and in fact relies on people further exerting their whiteness in an attempt to work towards Black liberation, which just really doesn't make sense if you think about it. No struggle towards liberation for any peoples should rely on the further exertion of the status and class of their oppressors to reach it. So it's funny that you brought that up, though, because this writer, there's some articles I've been reading on a website called Race Baiter, which is different than Race Trader. About this concept. I know, little play on words about this concept of allyship, though, and a frustration that people really want to hold on to this idea of whiteness, when in fact whiteness could be let go. And there is, do we know exactly what letting go of whiteness in the large social construct sense and understanding of it would look like? No, that's a theoretical exercise at this point. But does that mean that we can't do it? Does that mean that that's not what we should be working towards? Absolutely not. And in particular, I want to be clear, and this is going to be me being a little bit cheeky, but when we're talking about letting go of whiteness, that has nothing to do with white people dying. There seems to be some misunderstanding about this in certain circles of the internet, so I want to be very clear about this. But ultimately, everything that Jake is saying is true. There is a deeper history here than just the creation of whiteness. And I would encourage people to do reading about that history, to learn more about the foundation and creation of whiteness, which ultimately, is ancillary to the creation of Blackness, in order to justify a budding capitalist system through chattel slavery. So there's really, but people's reluctance and honestly, it boils down to people being scared and threatened and being unwilling to let go of power in this current system, and being unwilling to even be imaginative about what that could look like. And it's people like Rob and Diangelo who create this illusion that you can reach the end goal of an anti-racist future through a liberal politic and without actually letting go of your whiteness, which is something that I have a lot of frustration with. So definitely resonating with what you're speaking about, though, Jake.
I had a quick question. Okay, so you were saying white allyship, you're kind of referring to people that being encouraged to use their white privilege as a way to relinquish power, but if you're using your privilege, you're not relinquishing your power. Is that okay? Exactly.
And there are other terms that people prefer. I've heard accomplice. I've heard comradeship,
co-conspirator.
Yeah, things like that. And there's a lot of there's different histories behind those words. I prefer any of those words to allyship. Because allyship ultimately is transactional in nature. It allows people to, if you think about allies in war, they're people that align with each other to achieve a goal. But if the socio-political context changes, that allyship can be broken immediately.
Totally.
Whereas an accomplice, and I haven't done a full breakdown of accompliship. This is something that I heard sort of in the context of, having somebody standing by you while committing a crime, basically, and it not mattering it. And that actually speaks a little bit larger to a concept that I'm learning about right now, which is the concept of Afro-pessimism, which is a a part of Black studies, Afro-pessimism being like a full embracing, and forgive me if I'm completely butchering this definition because this really is a new concept for me, but a full embracing of the like pathology of Blackness, a full embracing of the negativity that is defining of Blackness. And to me, it's almost apt that you would use the term accomplice to speak about that, because the pathologization, the criminality of Blackness, which is something that is feeling very prescient in this current moment, really would require somebody being willing to aid you in that crime of your own Blackness to work towards liberation. I've also heard comradeship, which I'm also here for. I'm not mad at any of these terms, but ultimately how a really great friend of mine and a Black journalist and scholar and fellow Twitch streamer sort of talks about it is, once again, this idea of linking our struggles in a way in which like recognizing that our struggles cannot be completely pulled apart. In order to work towards a better future for all of us, like we really need to link our struggles. And that gets rid of this idea of like transactional nature, this like fair weather connection between yourself and somebody else. And ultimately too, like Blackness, and I should say anti-Blackness is in a lot of ways, and is spoken about in Black studies, as sort of the foundation and the basis for all other forms of oppression, because there is always an ultimate other of a Black body to like compare all other oppressed peoples to, and this idea of like proximity to Blackness then coming into play, like what is your proximity to Blackness, and this like dangling of the potential of somehow being assimilated into white society, but like oppressed peoples knowing that like that's never actually going to happen. Like oppressed peoples will never actually, like people of color, non-Black people of color will never be white, even if they are told that they're like the model minority, or it sort of all becomes like different ways to continue to oppress Black and brown people and other marginalized groups, with this like ultimate figure to compare them to, and like and say like the closer you get to this, the further away you are from us, the like ideal, I say that with quotation marks, humanity or human. So
thank you for all of that.
That was quite the intro. I'm sorry.
No, that's perfect.
Well then.
No, that's really rich. I feel like there's no format to this, and if that's in there, that's important. And I was engaged. I think you were going off. Hell yeah. Nah, for real.
Took us on a journey.
And I think a lot of what we touched on kind of frames up some of the material that we prepared to respond to and dialogue with today. So the first thing we're going to look at, and we'll make sure you can hear it nice and clearly on the episode, is a video concept by a local artist and movement educator, revolutionary Ricardo Levins Morales. And in it, he's describing what he terms moon spaces and sun spaces in the relationship to power in social justice work or community organizing or people's struggle. And I think that, when we were just discussing the hijacking of left-wing language, the hijacking of racial justice language by city council people or county officials or state officials, and how they could be heavy on the language, but really light in terms of doing something different or having a different impact or actually changing things. And I think this video provides some good perspective as to like why that is the case or what's happening when we see that, where real power is. And I think, just to bring it back, we haven't even spoken explicitly about the fact that we've all been enveloped inside of this Minneapolis uprising in the response to the murder of George Floyd. So we're going to hear from Ricardo, and then I'd like to reflect on the way we've seen this concept show up in this moment, in the response to the murder of George Floyd, going back to the period between the occupation of the 4th Precinct in 2015 and the murder of Jamar Clark, city council proceedings, mayoral proceedings, and now this moment, where that leaves us. That's kind of like where my mind is at. And then we're going to go look at the famed, internationally renowned Minneapolis City Council. So should I just press play on my computer on this one?
Mm-hmm.
A lot of movements find themselves at one time or another negotiating for power in what I call a moon space. By a moon space, I mean the places like union negotiating tables, peace treaty negotiations, courtrooms, legislatures, the places where contending forces try to settle their differences and come up with a decision. I call them moon spaces because they don't generate power. The moon does not generate light. It reflects light from the sun. The sun spaces are where the people are, where the power is generated, where the movement, where the contending forces represented in those moon spaces get their energy and their strength from. And if we're in a negotiation that's not going well, where we don't have a lot of leverage, a lot of times it's not about our skills. It's about the fact that we would actually need to be on the street. We don't need to be at the table. We're often fighting for a place at the table. Well, that may or may not be to our advantage. Sometimes it's to our advantage to be doing more organizing, creating more alliances, raising the level of militants, something that is going to give us more energy at our backs when we go into that moon space to do the negotiations. So people who spend a lot of time in the moon spaces often come to believe that that's where the power is, that that's where the story is really being written. They think of themselves, especially if they didn't go in with a real strong power analysis, as being the spear when they're really just the point of the spear and the hands holding that spear on the outside. And that in order to really be able to take advantage of these spaces, there needs to be an organic connection. It's not so important whether you're inside the system or outside the system, but whether your feet are firmly planted in the community where the power really originates.
Bars.
Yeah.
Can I add some slight bars to this?
Please.
Okay. I was just thinking about this as I was hearing that again. And something he doesn't necessarily touch on, he sort of grazes over, but I want to connect this to something else. So bear with me for a second. But he talks about the people have a tendency to think that power is built in the moon spaces and have this tendency to spend a lot of time in those spaces feeling like that's where the story is written. And I want to talk a little bit about this tendency and frame it sort of in the concept of the moon itself. The body that is the moon itself. He doesn't talk about this. He talks about the moon as something that reflects the sun's light. But what we also know is that the moon is responsible for the tides, right? So like the moon pulls. The moon does pull. The moon does have power, right? But that power is not. It has that pull and that like tendency to move water and attract water towards it. So I'm thinking about like people's tendency to move towards these moon spaces, people's tendencies to adjust and turn towards, rather than an abolitionist mindset to a reformist mindset, from a radical leftist perspective to a moderate or neoliberal perspective. And I would be interested in hearing what your thoughts are and like what it is about these moon spaces that really creates that pull, of like how they so effectively pull people in, because I think they do such a good job doing that. And I have my thoughts, but I'd be curious on what your thoughts are as well, or if you have any thoughts. I know I just sprung that addition onto you.
I mean, I guess I think of a moon space as like any sort of institution or organization, or like the media I think of as a huge moon space, and that kind of fits with that idea of like pulling in the tides and swaying public opinion and like all this. I mean, we're talking about like the national attention that the city council is getting now for abolishing the MPD.
I'm so glad they did that.
I'm so glad that I never have to see a police officer again.
That cop I didn't see in my rearview mirror on the way here, and I was sweating. That never happened. I'm glad. It was a little throwback I had. Yeah.
Yep.
But yeah, just I think of the sun space as like people in community, in relationship, friendship, whatever, but that organic chemistry that happens between people. And that's what I saw at the 3rd Precinct.
Yeah.
I didn't see organizations feeling that. I saw community feeling it. I saw community, setting up medic tents and hauling milk and water to the curb and snacks,
food. Yep.
giving out diapers. Like, that wasn't an organization. That wasn't a moon space that made any of that happen.
The organizations were gone by 3 p.m.
Oh, yeah.
Once the sun was gone.
Once the sun was gone, so were the organizations.
Yeah.
I would also just add, like, this idea of the moon having this pull to me really speaks to the tendency that we have to revert to the status quo, and like the struggle. It's like called a struggle for a reason, right? Like, it's not easy subverting the status quo. It's not easy breaking out of oppressive systems. And so often we want, I feel like as humans, often, especially humans in like the modern era where we just like want everything easily at our fingertips at all times. I feel like people have a tendency to search for the easiest path to get somewhere. And when, liberalism and co-option is taught to them as the easiest path to get there, why work, right? Like, it becomes like why are they doing these things? Like, why is this so difficult? And so to me, like, it also speaks to like the tendency that we have to like move towards those spaces when we're unwilling to be creative and think outside of the system that we're taught exclusively to think and process and move within.
Yeah, I guess I see it as like mesmerizing and glittering and safe and inviting and familiar. And working within those confines, it's comforting. Like, as to why someone would be more drawn to that moon space, and like if that's where that glitter is and where the celebrations are and the trophies are lauded, then you're like, okay, yeah, I want that on my resume.
Yeah,
I want to be there.
Can I ask?
Absolutely.
Can I ask y'all, when was the last time you looked at the moon? How familiar is the moon to you?
We have a little moon chart in our
It's
bedroom.
like pretty familiar, right?
Oh,
Like,
nice.
a lot of people look at the moon daily, except when the new moon's happening and things.
Yeah.
When was the last time you looked at the sun? You know what I mean? Like, you can't.
Yeah.
You can't.
Yeah.
You can't directly look at the sun. So it's unfamiliar. And in fact, it's
overwhelming.
dangerous to look directly at the sun, right? Like, it's
I have a practice of looking directly at the sun.
You and Trump.
That's funny because that's the one thing during his presidency where I was like, I don't know, I think he's onto something.
y'all got something really in common here.
Hey, my friend taught me, I don't know. All right, I'm going to go out on a limb and defend my position. It's like, I feel like I need the vitamin D or the warmth or the power or as a part of my prayer. It's like understanding that I need to protect my skin from the sun to a certain extent, but also like I need the sun's rays. Like, I need that power. I need that medicine. Like, I deal with depression. I'm like trying to think of a holistic life, and I'm recognizing that like that sun makes everything grow and gives everything life, and that's power. So it's a part of my prayer to look directly at the sun. And the meditation I bring with it is like, my mind is a garden, like I have a choice what I'm going to plant and what I'm going to cultivate. And if I'm in a meditation around cultivating a positive space in my mind, then like direct humility and reception of the sun feels like a part of that to me. Also, you're probably supposed to protect your eyes and shit. I don't know.
Yeah. But also, what about your eyes, Jake?
Yeah, but it's also to say, I think that like the way you connected that imagery, that the question that Kaylee asked, and then the sparkling comfort of the moon, and I think about like where you want to like hunker down under the moonlight and the nighttime and the magic, and to recognize that that's like there's like safety and softness in that, and beauty and romance in that. And the sun a lot of time is like scalding and dangerous.
It's messy.
Yeah, it's a lot easier to dress up in some nice clothes and go sit in them nice chairs and get paid $120,000 a year or whatever Jacob Fry gets paid than it is to go fucking get tear gassed or go organize a union or do the hard or make $28,000 a year. It's like something really inviting about those halls of power, And I think that the political culture has been to encourage people to look in that direction and see that as where the power really is. And the history of like militant unionism or on the ground organizing has been hidden for us, so people don't see all the value that they could get from that. You know, a lot of the quote that like resonates with me, that somewhere in the revolution will not be funded, is they took the next generation of Huey Newtons or Fred Hamptons and they turned them into program managers, you know, where a lot of people who really are talented and dedicated got put on that path, where if you would have showed them the model of Fred Hampton or showed them the model that you could go another way, I feel like people would follow that light, but it's hard to find it.
Yeah. And like the moon really is like a bit of a suck, you know, like it's a power suck. It like absorbs it absorbs the it reflects the sun's rays, but like it's just like this cold rock. Whereas like, have you seen videos of the sun? Like I'm a science nerd, okay? I really enjoy looking at science nerdy things, like stuff out in space. And like the sun is tumultuous. The sun is raging at all times, like sunspots and like flares
solar
and things, flares.
Yeah.
They're wild. They're wild and untamed, and so yeah, I think that is really quite the contrast to like this pearly, shiny, pristine, if you will. This is a word that I really have problems with, that I think about a lot, but rock of the moon that just sort of sits there looking beautiful in the night sky. So yeah, and I think that, what a great analogy.
I guess if you want to go deeper into it, you could be like, the moon revolves around us and the sun is what we're all revolving around. So like we get our
Okay.
we get our path from the sun.
Yeah.
And the moon gets its path from us.
Damn.
Damn.
Yeah.
Real shit.
Yeah.
I'm wondering too about the cycles of the moon in terms of how visible it is, its reflective capacity at certain moments, and even realizing like the heat that was generated in the streets gives the moon so much power to reflect right now. And is like, in the sense of like, does it have the capacity to actually do it? Are they going to cut $42 million from the police budget in July? That's the demand that the sun is making, you know? So I'm wondering in terms of how that relates to organizing, or how do you maximize on what's there? You know, it's like you said, it's like reading this or responding to this piece from Ricardo, taking that in, it's obvious to acknowledge that like the primacy of the sun, or like the importance of it, but then also recognizing like you can't live without the moon either. So I'm not trying to just throw away that space. I get so frustrated with it but I'm also realizing I don't want to overcorrect and completely lose the capacity to change public policy. But it's hard to know, you know. I don't know.
And it also speaks to the fact that like what Isaac say, like the moon should revolve around us.
Yeah.
It should be it should be a reflection of the sun space. Like it should be, in an ideal world, in a world that feel like we're all working towards, it should work to the benefit of us. And it isn't. And the degree in which our systems need to be dismantled and rebuilt to create a world that looks like that, to me is just like, I mean, maybe it's just because I'm like young and pretty radical still, but it's just like not up for discussion. Like this stuff needs to be completely dismantled. And you're right, like what's going to happen in the sun space. I also want to point out, y'all on who are listening to this podcast, it's the summer solstice today when we're recording this, which is like feeling like just a strange coincidence, but also like pretty powerful. So the longest day of the year is happening right now. And so to me, I feel like there's so much power around that. And I feel like there's so much power about around the uprising. And I think what I'm feeling really scared about is that power is going to diminish, and that power is going to be sucked in by the moon space and then spit back out at us as citizens, as people, as like not what we wanted, not what we needed ultimately, and definitely not what we asked for. So
yeah, that's real. I feel like my biggest fear is that this won't become practice. Like everyone's seen how effective the community's response, whether it be here, whether it be in Atlanta, And I'm sure it'll happen further, but like the results that have happened as a result of people getting together in the street, and some people burn shit, some people are peacefully protesting, some people are just feeling their emotions and doing it together. And it's more changes happened in Minneapolis than in a while, I guess, in terms of like a public attitude shift that I've seen.
Oh, hell yeah.
Yeah, first precinct getting burned down. That's
Third
like
precinct?
The third precinct, like the first precinct.
The first, yeah,
the
like,
first,
the first, like the first ever. Yeah, no, I feel that.
The first third.
The first third.
Yeah.
Hopefully the last third. We'll see. Yeah, no, I feel that too, and this stuff, and you know, I remember being out there actually with Jake on like day 2. We were down at third precinct before the precinct burned, and I remember like having a conversation with you, and then ultimately having conversations with other people as well. Like, how does this feel in relation to 2015? How does this feel in relation to other movements that have happened here? And I think the consensus from everybody, and you know, I'm new to the scene, so I can't. This is my first experience, but the consensus was this is completely different. Feeling completely different than anything that's happened here in the past, 20 years, or at least 2015 and at least Occupy, which were sort of the 2 largest movement moments in the past 2 decades. So I really want us to hold on to that, and I really want it to be known that like this level of disruption can be useful and is possible at all times. And I also want to point out too, like Isaac, you brought up like peaceful protesters versus people burning shit and stuff. Like everybody has a role to play, which is really what that Crime Think piece laid out really, I think, beautifully. If you haven't read it, Crime Think wrote a piece about the siege of the third precinct, and I would recommend it, and lays out the importance and the fluidity of all of those separate roles working simultaneously and in connection with one another, though not in a planned way, not in an organized way, right? Like, It's not like, this wasn't like the intention.
It's not like Hong Kong where they like show up with gear and are ready to go, but there's,
But we also, we learned a lot from Hong Kong, though. I'm not gonna lie, by like day 2, day 3, like people were deploying Hong Kong tactics on the street. Like I remember being downtown and like everybody was carrying around traffic cones because you could put traffic cones over the top of tear gas canisters.
I've seen a lot more people throwing projectiles back, or like tear gas canisters back, where I feel like in 2015 or other times I've seen tear gas deployed, I didn't see that as often. Maybe that's about career, or maybe it's just the vibration people are on, or how just
that critical mass, I feel like.
Yeah. I listened to a dope thing yesterday too. Cosmonaut podcast did like a out loud reading of a letter that a Egyptian protester who was involved in the Tahrir Square movement and some other movements wrote, in terms of like, it was more tactical, like advice to protesters on how to properly sustain a movement or movement. It gave me some good insight. Hell yeah. Damn, I had a thought, but I forgot. Oh, I was thinking about what Ricardo said in this, and the idea that some people think if we're not getting the policy results that you want. So think about last year. I remember the last 2 years, like the tone of December, when I reflect on last December and the December before that, is intense feelings of disappointment around going to testify around the police budget. Like salute to Reclaim the Block and Black Visions Collective, because organized some really powerful rounds. There's 3 public hearings when people can go give testimony to the city council, and both years I went and I participated, and there's so much that goes into making that happen, and such an overwhelming response. Like, there is a different level of public will now for police abolition, but if you would have followed the city council proceedings in the last 2 years around the police budget, there was an overwhelming flood of public comment and public support for the idea of defunding the police. So the idea now that city council people are somehow, it's new to them, or they weren't getting pressure before, But I think the critical difference is this idea of moon space or sun space, where I remember going up there and coming home like literally spiritually vexed, because it's like I pour my heart into that testimony. I respect so much what people are doing. I like allow myself to feel some hope, and then just get shit on by them and realize like it's like, damn, it's like we might as well not have shown up the way they responded.
Yeah.
And realizing that it's not about lack of skill. It's about, we didn't build sufficient pressure, or like we're so caught in that liberal mind frame that that's where the power is, that the broader public response and anger and the direct action on the streets and the redistributing wealth and the burning of the police precinct and the taking of public space and the grassroots organizing changed the calculus. But what I'm recognizing now is like it still is not time to go jump back into the moon space, is what I'm realizing is like, like the sufficient threat has not been levied against Capitol. I don't think. I'm really curious to hear, are they gonna, do you think they really will cut the budget this summer? Because to me it looks like they're kind of trying to skate around it. So realizing that was a couple days of spontaneous uprising. We have more tools in our arsenal to disrupt the flow of the city and to generate that solar heat to make different possibilities possible. You know what I'm saying? They shut down every single port on the West Coast yesterday. That type of shit. That's incredible.
Yeah.
No international shipping into the West Coast. That's fucking lit.
I didn't even hear about that. Wow.
Yeah, the International Longshoremen's Union. It's like a militant union that's comprised of a lot of black and brown working class folks all up and down the West Coast. And they, for the movement for Black Lives and the demand for defunding the police, shut down every single port from Southern California to the state of Washington.
Interesting.
And huge marches.
So are you saying that they understand that we also need to be talking about anti-capitalism?
That's the thing. It's like the real anti-racist movement in the United States is on the left. If you look at the South in Reconstruction, and the whole time it was communists and left-wing people who were doing the real work and building real alliances with black workers. Look at Fred Hampton and the Young Patriots and the original Rainbow Coalition. Like the idea that identity politics is anti-left, or that the left is anti-identity politics, that's contrived and constructed, and it's meant to be a trap, because people will understand definitely that slavery was a part of capitalism and that white supremacy is a part of capitalism. Got me going now. I was thinking about, I think
that's the next battle to be forged, is connecting those two and like just like reminding people that slavery hasn't ended. Like this is all tied up in abolition with the police and prisons.
There's a reason why they use the word abolition to talk about a number of different issues beyond oops, sorry. What's that mean? I don't know. That wasn't even me.
My fault. I'm working on this goofy ass tablet. Yeah.
I feel it. That there's a reason why the term abolition is used to talk about all of these issues. So, I personally, I don't think people understand that slavery is connected to capitalism. In fact, I know for a fact that there are people who I have either listened to or interacted with before who claim that like capitalism is not inherently bad and is not inherently tied to slavery, which is just like, people don't understand. People don't know the history. People like to decontextualize things, and particularly this idea of identity politics that you're talking about, Jake, like the misuse of identity politics as a way to devalidate movement work around those same identities is a huge part of neoliberalism, is a huge part of like that, of like a liberal brand of politics that is designed to simultaneously appear socially progressive and quote unquote woke, but are unwilling to acknowledge like the importance of addressing the current positionality of different peoples, of different identities within the system, within this system and multiple systems, as well as the connections between those systems. So yeah, I definitely feel a lot of frustration there.
Yeah, a lot of people don't know. I guess what I'm saying is people have known that, and there are people who do know that, and I think we're living through the tail end of like a wave of like intense and deep repression that was like reprisal from the social movements of like the 60s and 70s, and like stomping out that consciousness and that like left-wing anti-racist revolutionary tradition was a part of that. And it's cool to see that like coming back to life now and breaking through the cracks and becoming more mainstream. Should we hear from some of our city council members?
Who should we start with?
Can anybody pull up that Steve Fletcher one? Because
Yep,
I'm
I
getting
got
blocked.
it.
But I
Yeah.
got the Andrew Johnson one up too.
Yeah, I feel like we
found
got to warm up for the Andrew Johnson one. Also.
Oh, we
it.
do.
So start with Steve Fletcher.
Yeah.
Steve Fletcher is a city council member for Ward 3. Where is Ward 3?
Northeast.
It's Jacob. Northeast?
Yep.
It's Jacob Fry's old ward.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. We
Yep.
were talking about that earlier.
It's like lower Northeast Minneapolis and
Okay.
Dinkytown and a portion of the North Loop. I think a lot of the North Loop actually.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Okay,
Yeah.
okay. Yep, seeing it in my mind.
It was Steve Fletcher won that race in a contested competition with Socialist Alternative
Yeah.
member Ginger Jensen,
yep.
and Samantha Priest Stinson, who I think might go by a different name now. Forgive me if I'm spreading outdated information. But yeah, it was like a hot race. Steve Fletcher squeaked that one out. Y'all know Steve Fletcher was one of the founders of Knock, which he likes to hold up as a badge of honor, which is a good example of like a popular rhetoric being very divorced from reality on the ground. A lot of great people connected to Knock and a lot of solid work done. Also tons of trauma and dysfunction, and Knock's not around any longer, you know.
I would love
but
to pick your brain more about it sometime. It's funny that you bring them up. This is the second time they've been brought up in a 2-day span for me, and I have no idea who this group is.
they
because
definitely
of my, like,
contributed
young
to this
history.
moment, you know. That's a part of the movement legacy. And again, like, I don't want to get too deep into it now because we haven't like talked
Yeah.
about it, but salute to everybody who put in a lot of good work at Knock, and salute to everybody who's still trying to heal and take them lessons out of Knock. You know, that was like a wild time. Steve Fletcher also though came out of, I think, maybe the labor movement.
I know he was an Our Revolution candidate.
Our Revolution
So he's part of
candidate,
Bernie's
yeah.
legacy.
Right. Yeah.
And I remember that Ginger Jensen won first choice votes, and then he squeaked it out on the ranked choice voting tabulation.
Interesting too if you look at the dynamics between Samantha Stinson, Priest Stinson's role in that race, because she had some very anti-socialist rhetoric, you know, and Ginger's campaign was around rent control. Very much rent control was like a big piece of that. And she was against rent control. So was Steve Fletcher. So like the way those second choice votes worked, there's like interesting lessons to be pulled around left liberal coalitions, I think, in that race.
And I also think that it's interesting if you think about like what's happened in that area since this race 3 years ago. Knowing like what Socialist Alternative is about, like running on a platform of rent control, I can think of off the top of my head 4, maybe 5 new high rises that have gone up in that area in the last 3
Yeah.
years alone that
Yeah.
have been like
I mean,
completed.
it feels like downtown is just expanding
It's-
across
right,
the river,
yeah,
basically.
yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I mean, for folks who've been listening to the podcast, too, Steve Fletcher's ward is one of the wards adjacent to the Upper Harbor Terminal. You know, it's the riverfront in lower Northeast Minneapolis, one of the most aggressively, heavily gentrified neighborhoods in the city. So when Brittany Lewis, who was on our show early in our releases in the first season, she talked about the gentrification of Northeast, like the mass displacement of working class people that happened. Jacob Fry was responsible for that in a large part, and Steve Fletcher stepped into the legacy of that, and it's only been exacerbated since then, you know. So it's big money real estate interests behind Steve Fletcher that Steve Fletcher's working with. And Steve Fletcher voted for the increase in the police budget. Steve Fletcher voted for Section 18, and RAD as a supporter explicitly denied any criticism of that. Steve Fletcher's been against rent control, has not been advocating for rent control. Should we hear what Steve Fletcher has to say about police abolition? So the other thing I want to say before we read this is that within, I don't know how many hours or weeks after the murder of George Floyd, you have Steve Fletcher, a white man who makes 6 figures as a city council person, getting op-ed space in Time magazine, leading national publication, a couple months after he just gave the MPD an unprecedented budget increase. So first off, before we read anything, that's fucking foul as hell. Fuck you, Steve Fletcher.
True. Now, let's hear from Steve Fletcher himself about the reason why this is not actually his fault. Let's go. So he starts off talking about the murder of George Floyd. I'm not going to read that bit, if that's okay with everybody.
Yeah.
This is what I will say about this first paragraph is that this first paragraph has become commonplace in corporate spaces, in public official spaces. Once again, it's something that feels very disrespectful to me. This speaking to of the pain and suffering of the Black community right now in this moment around the murder of George Floyd, yet like not wanting to have a substantive conversation about like why this took place in the first place, and what it was that allowed for this to happen. So anyways, he says, when I ran for Minneapolis City Council in 2017, I knew that the police department had a decades-long history of violence and discrimination. I ran on a platform of police reform, y'all, informed by my experience seeing police persistently harass young Black canvassers that I worked with as a community organizer, and by the police shooting of Jamar Clark in 2015, which prompted weeks of protests outside the 4th Precinct. In 2017, the police shooting of Justine Damond further cemented accountability as a central theme of that campaign year. Jake,
that was the white yoga teacher from Australia, right?
Yeah. Who was killed by a Black police officer, a Black Somali police officer. I'm assuming that when he talks about his work as an organizer, he's talking about Nakir.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Love how you can't get, what is this, like 5 sentences in without like trying to like throw your credentials as an organizer out at us.
He's a community organizer. Did you know that?
I didn't know.
So is Jacob Fry, but we won't get into that.
Gentrifying?
I just thought he was a marathon runner.
Oh, goodness. Okay. In my first 2 years on the council, several factors have reinforced the context for reform. Minneapolis police officers shot and killed 4 more people: Thurman Blevins, Travis Jordan, Mario Benjamin, and Chiashir Phong Vu, and were caught in a body cam audit asking EMTs to sedate suspects and others with ketamine. He doesn't say this, but they got caught asking people to use ketamine without their consent, to be clear, which is a very key point here, is that they were drugging people without their consent.
Was that around the Super Bowl? Or like was that? Yeah, I was trying to remember when that happened.
I can't remember.
Yeah.
That rings true to me, but I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
The Police Federation refused to comply with the department ban on warrior training and took an intentionally divisive onstage role at a Trump rally that was back in, what is that, like September of last year?
Yeah.
I've been surprised then by how difficult and controversial it has been to pass. Sorry, I can't take this seriously. I have been surprised then by how difficult and controversial it has been to pass the relatively small budget changes that we have made, which have not even cut their budget but merely redirected some proposed increases to fund a new Office of Violence Prevention. Other programmatic proposals to change the way we police have been met with stiff institutional resistance. The weight of that history was especially heavy when we learned of George Floyd's murder. The accumulated grief and anger from years of police violence was brought to the surface, and thousands of people abandoned social distancing to take to the streets and demand justice.
I just want to say, like, putting in that comment about social distancing.
Yep.
Yeah, is that like a weird little scold?
Yeah.
No, it is. It totally is a
feels
scold.
like.
It totally is a scold. Especially if you think about the ways that Black people in particular have been over-policed through the process of coronavirus, and who have been routinely criminalized for their actions that are quote-unquote not observing social distancing. I've heard horror stories from my friends from my family here in Minneapolis, in St. Paul area, and also read numerous stories online of white people woke scolding Black folks for gathering, like one of my friends had like a barbecue at her house with the people she lived with.
Yeah.
And they weren't wearing masks and got scolded by their neighbor. Like, you know what I mean? It's just ridiculous.
Yeah, I saw someone I'm Facebook friends with, she posted photos of her neighbors and like shamed them on Facebook
Oh no.
for like
Yeah.
being at a barbecue.
That's
Yeah.
foul.
It was not a good look.
Bad news.
Yeah.
Don't post photos of your neighbors without their consent, and don't post photos of protesters. You know what I'm saying?
Without-
That's
yeah,
lessons
true.
we're
Little
learning.
PSA.
I just want to say something else too about this last paragraph. The fact that he says, "I have been surprised then by how difficult and controversial it has been to pass the relatively small budget pages." I call bullshit.
I call
It's like you called
bullshit.
yourself a community organizer 2 paragraphs ago. You talk about how big a part of it was of your platform, but you weren't prepared for resistance. You're still a Democrat. You don't understand that it's the same people that prop up your campaigns and work in your campaigns and lobby you that need a stronger police department to carry out the housing policy that you yourself passed. That is completely passing the buck. That's just,
It's the blame
it shouldn't
game.
be taken
Controversial to
seriously.
who?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying. And it was like you had way more public support in favor of cutting their budget. If you had 1 ounce of integrity or any spine or conviction, courage of your conviction, if you're really offended by the police, you
Yeah.
could have dealt with that criticism, or you would have had a strategy coming into this. That's weak as fuck.
Not only that, but like this is 2017. We're talking about like if you're running for city council, I would expect you to have some like modicum of understanding
Come on.
of what city council has been doing for the last like definitely since Jamar Clark in 2015, but it's like larger history as well in its relationship to the police union, the police federation, and for you to like bullshit, calling it.
Yeah.
Okay, let's see. Where were we? Okay, Minneapolis police had an opportunity to distance themselves from Derek Chauvin, to express sympathy, to be a calming presence. Instead, they deployed tear gas and rubber bullets, effectively escalating the situation from protests to pitched conflict. By the next day, it was clear that people on Lake Street were rallying for much more than the prosecution of 4 officers. They were demonstrating their anger at decades of harassment and racialized violence and calling for it to end.
Centuries.
Yeah, let's try that again.
Yeah.
Centuries. And the Minneapolis police had an opportunity to distance themselves from Jason Anderson, who killed Fong Lee, from Bob Kroll, who they elected with an overwhelming majority. It's been centuries. It's like that same, oh, geez, we thought they were going to.
Yeah.
That's that liberal Democrat idea. It's like, it's the same way they treat Trump, like surprised again by his hypocrisy. And it's like,
Yeah.
grow the fuck up.
Another one, Brian Rice, who has been, integral in his law firm being integral in negotiating these contracts, allowing abusive police to stay on their jobs. So that has multiple ties than just to the police department, but then also the park board and other institutions and agencies as well.
Abdi Warsame get elected, who is now in charge of public housing. Like,
Yeah.
his fingerprints all over.
Huge.
Huge. The lack of change hasn't been for lack of trying.
Yes, it has.
Yes, it has. There's just no other way to put this, y'all. Like, no, you don't know. Okay. No. Most of us who are currently in office in Minneapolis ran on platforms that included police reform and accountability. Can we just maybe articulate then that maybe reform isn't doing the job then? I don't think that this is so difficult to comprehend. You've been on the job. Many have been on the job for a while now, and reform isn't working. You then, and we'll get there eventually, but he talks about the numerous reform. And not only does he talk about the numerous reforms that failed, but I don't know if we'll get to it, but the city council referendum literally lays out all of the failures of city council to do police reform. And so once again, this is not surprising. No, you didn't actually try to change police. No, you didn't actually try to abolish the police. No, you didn't actually try to address the system of police violence that has led to police violence. So call him bullshit again.
You want to skip up to my assessment?
Yeah. My assessment of what is now necessary is shaped by the failure of the reforms we've attempted in the face of opposition from the department and the police federation. We have a talented, thoughtful police chief who has attempted some important steps. He has fired officers for significant abuses, only to have these decisions overturned, and those officers reinstated by arbitrators. Mayor Fry has met fierce resistance from the federation to implement even minor policy changes. Okay, wait. So this is the blame game.
Yeah, I don't give a fuck about arbitration. Like,
Yeah.
it's just another like scapegoat for like why you can't do anything meaningful. And like Mayor Fry's whole article is about arbitration, and I'm like, no one gives a fuck about arbitration. They want this shit gone.
And if you
Yeah.
have a problem with arbitration, change the system that allows arbitration to happen.
You have the power of the purse. If arbitration is getting in your way, make them fire people by how you cut the budget. You know, it's just like they're always looking for a reason why they can't do something when we need people who are willing to risk their body and their safety. That's the level of commitment people have on the streets. And what would it look like to have somebody in elected office who was willing to make that same type of sacrifice? It's like they fold. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm also just like, Arredondo, the police chief, is being used, I feel like, in such a foul way. Or I don't even want to say being used because he has agency. He's a cop. He's on their team. He might have a different ideological perspective than Bob Kroll. Either way, he's a cop. He goes and puts that uniform on. He's still in that job. He gets the same money with them. He supports them. You know, just like he's been used as such a distraction.
Assuming he like authorized that use of force to some extent.
Yeah.
No, and that's something that I wanted to speak to a little bit more in regards to the Andrew Johnson piece, which speaks to like, is like the scapegoating of the simultaneous scapegoating onto Arredondo, and also like the lack of recognition that Arredondo is and is part of the larger system of policing. That is a problem that they have agency to fix and are refusing to. It is something that's definitely frustrating for me as well. Let's see. Any other things that...
Yeah, I don't know if we have to read through this whole thing. I don't think we should. I'm looking through it now to see if there's some gems, if anybody else got...
Oh, I did have a question about this. He mentions after we cut money from the proposed police budget... So he talks about this point in which like I'll just read this one sentence. But after we cut money from the proposed police budget, I heard from constituents whose 911 calls took forever to get a response. And I heard about officers telling business owners to call their councilman about why it took so long. Is this real? Is this like a thing that happens?
They cut the budget 2 years ago?
They didn't cut it. They diverted some funds
to that. Okay, so that is at the moment that he's talking about where they diverted funds to this new officer response.
I don't know the details of like the public safety initiative that they've created, but they have created a program that is intended to bring less officers to the scene of certain incidents, I think, or there's like a violence prevention program that I don't know the details of, so I can't speak of, but it wasn't, so rather than cut the police budget, they reallocated towards this type of program, or maybe cut the amount the budget was going to be raised. There was an initial proposal by Fry. I don't even know what the fuck his name is anymore because I'm listening to people from all over. I'm like, I thought it was Fry.
Yeah, just say French fry.
French fry.
That's the way to remember it, yeah.
I heard somebody say, get some French phrase today. That was like a national podcast, and I was like, no.
Gentrify is what I know.
Gentrify.
But what's happened, I think, is that 2 years ago, there was an initial proposal from Fry for a certain amount of raise. They got some of that money diverted to this violence prevention program, but which still left the MPD with a big raise. It just wasn't the same amount of increase. Okay. And I do believe that the police would respond in that way. I do believe that they would withhold service to pressure politicians. They're dirty thugs. They'll do anything. They'll murder people. They do murder people. You know, they've been involved in so much criminality that I don't put anything past the police. And to some degree, I'm like sensitive to what Council Member Fletcher is communicating. Like, I understand that there are barriers. There is stiff resistance from the Police Federation. We expect better. We expect more. We expect a fighter than in those seats, or I do, I should say. And I think that there would be ways then to respond. I guess my biggest take away from this Fletcher piece, or something I think is important to remember around the whole conversation with City Council and the idea of them being in support of abolishing the police, is that you can't do that inside of a worldview that still allows for like capitalist real estate development, gentrification, a corporate wage structure that leaves so many in poverty, that doesn't account for actual reparations, that's not talking about building public housing and universal single-payer health care, because the police enforce like the capitalist power and property relationships, and they manage all those contradictions. So it's not serious to have like it's cool that they're willing to say those words, but like to take it seriously, you have to have a whole platform and a whole way of doing politics then that would allow for the abolition of the police. It's not an issue. That's again, I think all of us then have to like invite ourselves into a deeper commitment or understanding that like abolishing the police in America is like means revolution in a lot of ways. It means a total restructuring. So like if people want to be taken seriously, I feel like they have to then like incorporate that into every aspect of their public policy platforms.
Yeah. And I mean, even in this piece, he talks about what they want to do or what the need is now for the need being dramatic structural change. I shouldn't even say the reluctancy, the refusal of council people. Yeah, the refusal of council people to use the language of abolishment sort of like at all is something that like really frustrates me. So yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, and I think like Andrew Johnson kind of scolds that language in his.
Oh, he does. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think like something that really struck me when reading all these different articles is no one mentions housing, no one mentions poverty. They talk about like these alternatives to community safety, and they don't take that holistic view. They separate. Right. This is a policing issue. Let's talk about policing.
Right.
When it's related to housing, it's related to healthcare, it's related to
environmental injustices.
And like the people that are lining the mayor's pocket at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And they don't have that because they're not anti-capitalist at the end of the day. So they don't have that structural view of it.
And that I think anti-racist.
Yeah.
Because there's like no mention of racism. I'm just like kind of looking at this and like, does he mention white supremacy? No. Does he mention systemic racism? No. Yeah. But he talks about the police and saying like that they murder black people. So it's like it's a weird like, oh, you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Like we're on the same page.
Right.
Like speaking to his own audience and not really broadening it. Yeah.
And I think that ultimately speaks to the fact that like at the end of the day, policing was really always intended to protect capital. So when they're talking about safety, they're talking about when they use safety in this context without acknowledging the rest of these systems, they're not addressing what Black people would consider safety, what other marginalized groups would consider safety. What they're talking about is especially this particular council person who is once again in one of the most rapidly gentrifying areas, and also includes some very high-end and expensive areas of town as well. Mm-hmm. For them, safety is safety of their capital, right? Like it's making sure that their investments are protected, making sure that their $1 million condos aren't depreciating in value, making sure that the investments happening around them. So, for example, thinking about like the siege of the 3rd Precinct, and this, also the burning of the development that was going up there.
Yeah,
like that's what they don't want. So when they're thinking about safety, they're thinking about safety in that context: safety of capital, safety of investment. And they can say that that's not what they're thinking all that they want, but I think ultimately, like, if you're unwilling to speak to those systems, it doesn't really matter what your intentions are. The end result will always be the status quo, which is the protection of capital, which is what policing has always intended to do.
Yeah, and it's kind of insulting that for him to be like, I was a community organizer, not name that you have this organization called MPD 150, and their whole like mission is to educate and inform like Minneapolis Police Department's history, that it's founded in racism, and like this work was there.
Right.
Like there were people doing this work. It was just like, were you making the intentional effort to educate yourself?
No.
But police reform.
And not just, I feel like they're just like, God, this feels like a lifetime ago when we were still talking about Elizabeth Warren, but like, do you remember the big structural Bailey balloon? That
Yeah,
was
her
like,
dog.
Yeah, it was like
Yeah.
a giant blow up version of her dog. And so they always want to talk about like big structure, like the larger structure, but without ever naming what those structures actually are. And therefore like accidentally and unwittingly reinforcing those structures in the long haul. So yeah, like big structural reform, which makes no sense.
Should we move to Johnson's post?
Yeah.
Andrew Johnson's.
Yeah.
This was
So
This
great.
almost made me like rage quit. Like almost rage quit.
His pictures kind of also
Yeah,
like,
his Facebook profile and background picture are
it's pretty prime.
gems.
This is so yikes.
He's just like,
This
a
is a
guy.
yikes.
He's just a guy wearing a tie, and he's walking around, and there's like all these kids, and you don't know why they're there, but he's walking in front of these children.
Big yikes.
Is it a field trip? Are they going to Minneapolis Falls? Like, some kids have glasses. It's very inclusive.
Very inclusive. Diversity.
Yes. Diversity in backpacks.
Yep.
So this was a lovely Facebook post that was an email originally he sent to his newsletter subscribers that he shared with on his public platform. Should I start it off? Oh, okay. Well, like he starts it off really great. So let's talk about the future of policing and community safety. First, to dispel any misinformation or misunderstanding right up front, no, the City Council did not vote to abolish the police department. No, there have not been any decisions made on budget cuts. No, we cannot have lawlessness or anarchy. And yes, there are still emergency calls which will require armed law enforcement to respond.
Oh my gosh.
No anarchy.
You know what though? Mad props to my guy Andrew Johnson, who is the first person to admit that the Minneapolis City Council is not actually abolishing police.
Yes. Yes.
Big ups to you, my man. Oh yeah, this is so honestly maddening and enraging to read. It's just like, how do I say this? It's just like reeks of whiteness.
Mm-hmm.
Like, no, we're not going to abolish the police department. No, there haven't been any decisions made on budget cuts. No, we cannot have lawlessness or anarchy. And yes, there's...
Yes, we can.
Yes, we can.
I'd like to push back on that.
We just did.
Real shit. Challenge accepted. Yeah, and like there are still emergency calls which will require armed law enforcement to respond. That part in particular was like, I mean, I don't know if we don't have the space to talk about this here today, but like the people don't understand like that this language is coded language. This language is dripping in like racist coding, especially when you have an understanding of the fact that blackness is like criminality. Blackness is criminalized in this country. And so when you're talking about lawlessness, when you're talking about the need for armed law enforcement, what I hear you saying is like there will always be a need to police Black people, which is just something that feels very gross and icky to me.
Especially for where his ward is located geographically. It's like, you know, the white homeowner space that directly adjoins pretty much where the uprising was in some extent. It's like a little bit farther down, but it basically is right there. And it's not that it's all white people who live in his district, but the loudest ones and the ones that he represents, who are like the wealthier homeowners, definitely are concerned that the Black people are going to take over, you know, and he's just like directly addressing their fears. He is keeping it super real though. Complete lack of integrity for going up on that stage at Powderhorn.
Yeah.
And it's like the spirit of that was supposed to be abolitionist. That's like all this pomp and circumstance around that. And then for him to come back directly after it and say like, I lied like a motherfucker. Like, hey, salute to you, bro. You're finessing. That's just amazing.
Yeah. Shaking the hands, kissing the babies.
Yeah, exactly. And nobody, the people who needed to see him up on that stage at Powderhorn will see it, and they'll never see
Yes,
this. And the people that matter that will still vote for him will see,
Yeah.
it works out perfectly
His
for him.
newsletter subscribers will read it, and they'll
Yeah.
feel comfortable.
Oh, good, nice.
And,
Oh,
He's
And then they
for
can
us.
say, our council member was up there at Powderhorn.
Right.
Like, I'm actually an abolitionist.
Oh, God.
I'm going to skip ahead to the second paragraph, but we know George Floyd's murder was not an anomaly. There is a pattern across our nation tracing back 400 years to when Africans were kidnapped, tortured, murdered, and forced into labor through violence. Subjugation didn't end with slavery, and the disparities we see today in our city run unbroken from the actions and decisions from this past to our present.
Sometimes, never mind. I don't even know if sometimes, okay. Sometimes I really just want to tell white people that want to talk about my struggle as a Black person in this country to shut the fuck up. Like, this is just shut the fuck up, Andrew Johnson. Like, what the fuck do you know? And this is this problem that we've been speaking to for a long time, the ways in which they have been taught to speak to this struggle without actually ever addressing it, while simultaneously continuing to engage in actions that continue the struggle, continue Black oppression, like continue to subjugate us, in his words. So it's so disingenuous. It's so appropriative. And like, it's very much like a keep my name out your mouth moment for me. Like, stop.
Yeah, and that word pattern that he uses, I mean, it's baked into the system. I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. It's founded.
Yeah, it's like some heavy shit to say and then go give the police. And then in the same sentence still say we need to keep the police. It's like, are you hearing yourself speak right now? Like, the weight of those words are so... That's a life-changing reality to accept. So it's just, to me, it's like goes back to that point of like, what do these words mean when they get to this level? And people just know think that if they say them, they still not connected themselves to like the consequences of that or something. It's bizarre to hear it.
All right, let's continue.
Do we have to?
Oh.
No, I'm just kidding. No, just kidding.
Or we can just skip ahead to my favorite part, but
Let's do it. I want to hear the favorite part.
Okay, well, I really liked because we watched Westworld like a little bit ago, and oh my god, this is so long.
This is a long ass Facebook
I'm just
post.
going to Control F, find my favorite part. Okay, here we go. Okay. To be clear, no one has been advocating that we simply end MPD without an alternative public safety department to replace it. We cannot have a vacuum where there's no law enforcement, and we know that there will still be a need for armed law enforcement for some emergency calls. We cannot allow anarchy or a Wild West situation. Many of you are also exhausted from having to be on high alert in the aftermath of recent civil unrest and feel that law enforcement is needed more than ever.
Once again, completely ignorant of the racialized coding in his language in so many different ways, while also making a point that is just so fucking stupid. Like, can we talk for a second about like this wild west that you want to talk about?
That's what I Control F. I was like, I can't find this wild.
This
I know he said
wild west that you want to talk about. First of all, shout out to Will Smith.
Yeah. That mechanic tarantula, love that.
That's what I was thinking. I was like, spiders? I remember a spider.
Tarantulas. No, this wild west that was filled with sundown towns where Black people were not allowed to be past sundown. This wild west where indigenous people were hunted down and genocided. This wild west where racism and oppression in many forms was at its all-time high. And in fact, this lawlessness that they're speaking of was really like state-sanctioned violence against these groups in order to secure the colonial future of this land. So please tell me more about the lawlessness of the Wild West that you're seeing here. Like, it's tropes like these that are passed off and talked about as if they are harmless. that are part of the white supremacy that is perpetuated every single day through normal, I say that in quotations, day-to-day speak, this like race talk through and through. And and so yeah, it's like it's pretty gross. And once again, I really just my whole body is just wanting to tell this person to shut the hell up. But yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, and when I think of Wild Wild West, I think of sheriffs, and it's like that's what's happening. Yeah. That's what is already happening, and you're trying to say like we don't want this to happen. Like it's just he's telling on himself so bad.
Yeah, power without consequences. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's like we can't have anarchy, but we can't have white supremacy. You know, that's cool. Don't worry about that. But we won't have anarchy for sure. Or like, yeah, just I can't believe that he didn't have like a bell go off in his mind when he was writing the words Wild West. And I'm just thinking about like how many Native people stood up and fought back, and like his air, you know, it's all Native land, but especially his area there's like so much rich Native history, and he's going to use that Wild West word just so casually. And then I'm thinking that this sentence, many of you are also exhausted from having to be on high alert in the aftermath of civil unrest and feel law enforcement is needed more than ever. Who is you? So he's talking about like the white homeowners or the people that live in his district who were inconvenienced by having to maybe stay up and watch their block or like smell smoke or something. He completely forgot about the murder of George Floyd that he like dramatized so deeply in his like opening paragraph, and right back goes to like, don't worry, I know you're afraid of looters and rioters, and we'll still have the pigs with the guns there for you. It's just like, what a fucking piece of shit. There's like, I wish I had better words for it than that, but I think you're not serious. It's hard to respect somebody who has this level of like dissonance in the language that he'll use. Somebody who'll go stand up on a stage and make a dramatic pledge supposed to be in solidarity with the organizers and people who are fighting to get for their lives, who have loved ones who have been lost, and then to come back and write this long ass Facebook screed like defending his white constituents. It's just like, what a clown.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree. And also so much disrespect there to the protesters, the people who are out here fighting, who are part of this uprising every single day, like putting their bodies on the line. Like this like lack of safety and like this faux sense of lack of safety and security that white politicians are exploiting to justify increasing policing, increasing police budgets, and such is just like so disrespectful to me. Like, I'm sorry. I'm Black. I don't feel safe in America ever. There is not a single day, not a single time that I feel safe in America. Do you want to know why? Because I know that at any moment I can be murdered for literally nothing. That can take place anywhere. That can take place in my car at a traffic stop. That can take place with me walking down the street. That can take place in my own home, where police can come into my home and murder me in cold blood and face no consequences for it. And so this is the amount of disrespect here. It is pretty abhorrent, and but not at all unexpected either. I would just like to say, yeah.
Yeah, he's weird as fuck too. I've seen him in real life.
Tony's goofy. Yeah.
Yeah. Man, we deserve so much better. That's what I keep thinking.
I would love to hear, and I know we didn't like talk about this or have any readings for this, but what's your thoughts on on the other city council members who may be more well versed in using this language to their advantage, like say Andrea Jenkins, Philippe Cunningham, Jeremiah Ellison, and what role they play in maintaining the status quo and upholding systems of oppression, while simultaneously saying that that's not what they're doing.
I mean, we could just go straight to the Upper Harbor in that case and see how like Philippe has been pushing that project relentlessly.
Yeah.
That's the first thing that comes to mind. Yeah.
Yeah. Or I think even jumping on a national media opportunity to speak with Barack Obama. And it's
Yeah.
like, as if Barack Obama didn't heavily militarize a police department. At least he didn't fall on the side of the police every single time someone was murdered under his tenure. And as if Barack Obama's public policy wasn't capitalist imperialist. It's just, again, I think a really low bar. I understand that Philippe Cunningham has challenges. I understand that like racism and heteronormativity works against him and that has to be held. Also, he has a capitalist neoliberal worldview and supports really bad public policies. And to me, that's pretty shameless to get up there when you funded the police and talk with Obama and promote that when it's like Barack Obama ain't who we need to be talking to right now, you know? So I think, and I feel that the only one I've seen something from where I feel like there's like a baseline right now for solidarity is Jeremiah, because I know things about the way he acted on the ground that like gives me respect, you know? And I feel like I can have a dialogue with Jeremiah, and I do think that he's given his best effort. Again, I think that's why, to me, to really take seriously, I'm not trying to like take it to the realm of ideology, but when you recognize, like Ricardo said, if you're giving your best effort and it's not working, taking a step back and looking at the approach and acknowledging that being a Democrat and trying to move through the politics of the DFL and the city council are not going to yield us the results that we need. So I think I'm curious to see how Jeremiah might evolve or shift. And I'm not trying to say that as if like, you know, Jeremiah's grown as fuck and he's doing his thing, and I'm not trying to say like I got it figured out, but to me, that's why I'm a socialist and I'm not a Democrat. And there's like, I think approaching politics from a working class perspective that tries to leverage the sun space in a different way is really important. And I'm hoping that we can move in that direction, you know. Andrew Jenkins is a landlord, and Andrew Jenkins has voted for the increase in the police budget. I understand that Andrew Jenkins also has like a lot of courage, and Andrew Jenkins is a super talented poet is another thing. That's how I knew Andrew Jenkins first. So I'm not trying to sum them up as a person, but I'm not impressed with their tenure as a city council person, and I don't think that they're acting towards systems change, really.
And I think one thing, and once again, this might be my youth speaking again, but like one thing that just feels really frustrating to me is like, at what point do we recognize that these are all people with agency to and have been working within the system for some time, some of them even, at what point like is it less so like these are your challenges, these are your struggles, and more so like you're complicit in the system? And like at what point are you going to stand up and speak out against the system by removing yourself from that system because you recognize that you're not capable, or the system is not capable of changing from within at the ways that you have sort of asserted are possible? At what point do we like acknowledge that like this idea that like police reform not working is like now all of a sudden that we want something that we want to talk about? Like, no, like we've had killings on killings on killings for years now, for a long time. And this conversation always tends to be the thing, but like you're not doing anything. And at what point are you then complicit in the system rather than something that could be a vehicle for change? So I don't know. I know that that's me. I'm finding it hard to hold any sort of grace for people right now. And personally and quite frankly, I don't think that any of these people should have jobs. And ultimately, like, I don't even know how I feel about city council as a whole right now. Like, do we need to be rethinking like not a horizontal, like non-hierarchical structure for something like this? Like, how do we redo, like, what are alternative ways that we could be envisioning a municipal government outside of that is different from what we have now, that could be more in line with the future that we see? So
yeah, I think the idea of a mayoralship is completely flawed, like putting all that power in one person. Like, I don't think that'll ever totally work at the end of the day. Like, you can get a really good person in there, I think, but how will the system confine that person? It ultimately comes down to, I think.
And we're seeing that. Like, we're seeing like how Mayor Fry has shifted the blame to state legislators instead of like taking that on, and then council people shift it to him, to Mayor Fry, and it's just like this. I have like a bad example in my mind, but not gonna say. It's designed this way. It's designed to fail. Like, it's working. Like, you know, we are seeing like the system work really well. It's effective by being ineffective. And
we're seeing this, and we're seeing this everywhere too. Like, especially with the mayors. Like, thinking about Keisha Lance Bottoms in Atlanta. Thinking about Lori Lightfoot in Chicago, who are
London
also
Breed in San Francisco.
Yep, all people who are shifting this blame away from themselves into states, or making excuses, or not claiming the power that they technically have, but then wanting to speak to these struggles, wanting to speak to the social justice aspect of all of this, and claim that they're going to do different in the future, when they have shown us nothing but this.
Yeah, it makes me think. Makes me want to study moments like the general strike in 1934 in Minneapolis, or I know in Seattle they had a general strike where they like took over and started executing the functions of the municipal government in a different way, or like looking at the CHOP in Seattle now, or the ways that the uprising and the holding of space allowed people to function differently in the day-to-day, and really like get more clarity for me in terms of like, can we create enough power and disturbance where we could seize the levers of the state through electoral meetings, or get, you know, if we had a socialist city council, then would we be able to institute like the dramatic public policy changes that we need? That's like something to explore, and, you know, something we'll figure out through struggle, but then also recognizing that like taking that shift away from liberalism seriously to imagine what would like wrenching the power of like our day-to-day lives, of public policy, of land ownership, of law and order, accountability away from the state look like without the electoral interference. Like if we were able to strike or to hold space in a way where we decided how resources were moved or what the community expectations were, like really, I'm hesitant to use the word, but like really getting into the specifics of a revolutionary transfer of power and how could it look? And the question in myself, like, am I participating in that moon space, premature shift to the moon space by like talking about the public policy aspect, or even like, you know, I'm not so much, I don't usually tell people to vote, but I do kind of encourage people to pay attention. Like all the times we've been going to the meetings at the Upper Harbor, is that the right use of our time? Should we be, because it seems to me like, damn, we did a lot of good work, and right now there's nothing saying that we're going to win. You know, it's very likely that they'll pass the Upper Harbor as they planned. So it's like, okay, if we take Ricardo's advice seriously, how can we then apply that same hours and that same labor, but instead of going to the meetings or going to the city council meetings or trying to get somebody elected, is like, how do we shift that towards organizing our workplaces or organizing in the streets or building towards an insurrectionary moment where just then we're able to maybe shift public policy through disruption and the direct seizure of power, as opposed to like, it's got me think, I don't want to go too long because I know we've been recording for a grip, but makes me think about this whole, maybe we'll do a round 2 or next week talk about the referendum that the city council is looking at, this idea of like a year-long process and the way it's being lauded as democratic. And I have an ideal of democracy in terms of, I believe in like people's ability to govern their own affairs and direct management of and stewardship of our lives and our resources. But shifting that to that like big D democracy of like city sanctioned spaces, ultimately to like a charter that's going to go to the vote, that's actually anti-democratic, because like how many of them young people who are, and old people, it wasn't just young people, have been disenfranchised, who really led the movement to get it to this place,
right,
that won't be able to vote. It's like putting it to the popular quote unquote will, like Andrew Johnson's talking about now, gives so much power back to the white homeowners. And I think to really be democratic, sometimes are like, I realize those are some of the liberal sensibilities, is like fuck what they're talking about. They don't get to talk no more. Like the white homeowners who have been the beneficiaries of all this police violence, it's like get down or lay down. You know, like you don't actually get to get engaged. It's like we have to prioritize the people who haven't been engaged, which means some people are going to get boxed out for a while. And I'm comfortable with that. But it's really got me like wanting to like look more at historical examples and be able to articulate some alternative next steps more clearly.
And also just briefly on that too, like the ways in which putting this within the creation of a 1 year process, the ways in which the creation of a timeline like that is also like sucking a lot of energy out of the current moment, and is essentially a way to like diffuse energy over the course of like a longer temporal scale, that ultimately, as we've seen repeatedly in city processes past, is not going to lead to like a larger or deeper engagement. In fact, I guarantee that less people are going to come out to these meetings than who were in the streets any of the days that the protests were happening. You know what I mean? So it's a way to reclaim back that power into the moon, from the sun space into the moon space.
Yeah, and just seeing just seeing that movement by state level, opening businesses up even more rapidly after everything popped off. Like that's part of that diffusion, I feel like. But
yeah, if people are working, then they're not going to be in the streets because they have bills to pay. And if they're not on rent strike, then they're going to be like forced to work. And yeah, it's just like this compulsory to be working and not be engaged. Yeah, because the more that you're at your workplace, the less you have time to actually dig into any of this. And I think this like 1 year process is again like designed to be ineffective, designed to diminish any of this power. Yeah,
that's so real. One last thing I wanted to say about all the deflection that's happening about like, well, the city can't do it because the county's got to do it, or the county can't do it because the state's got to do it, and the state can't do it because when you're talking about the Minneapolis City Council and a lot of the state delegation that they're dealing with in the county, they're Democrats. They all are on the same team. And that's not to say that all Democrats are made equal. There's like a slight few that I feel like I could work with and respect. But even with them, at the end of the day, you're committed to this ideological organization that's moving this agenda, and those are your comrades. Y'all are part of the same organization as far as the people at the state level that you're criticizing. And I think that has to be called out and named as far as like between all these different levels of government, there is a continuity, and that continuity is the DFL, and the ideology of the DFL is a capitalist hierarchy that needs the police to function. So as long as you're kind of in that team, you're not really going to be able to move this agenda with like the proactive creativity that we need. Hell yeah. We've been recording for like 2 hours probably or something.
Yeah, we're going on 2 right now.
Pow. We can do some editing. You're just going to get the juicy bits. I don't know. Yeah. We'll see.
Two-part, yeah.
You paid your hard-earned money for this 2 hours. Thank you.
Yikes.
Hell yeah.
My bad, y'all.
No, it's cool. We really appreciated having you. I had a lot of fun. This is cool.
Yeah.
Really great.
No, quite the format. No, I loved it. I was a little bit nervous. I'm not used to like then again, this type of format felt more like off the cuff, sort of like what I'm used to with what I do on Twitch. So felt a little bit easier than like a planned, like, here's exactly what we're going to talk about point by point, and you need to think of good words to say about it. And I was just, so I appreciate that. And I appreciate y'all like coming over, breaking bread, sharing.
I got to try some of that banana bread now.
Yeah, it was super good.
It's pretty delicious, not going to lie. So, but yeah, no, just so much respect for y'all, so much respect for what you're doing with this podcast, and quite frankly, like so honored that y'all would think to include me in this project. So yeah.
Hey, where can people tune into your Twitch stream?
Yeah, so you can find me at twitch.tv/Kswiftly. That's SWIFTLY with a K at the front, the letter. And same thing on Instagram, Kswiftly1 on Twitter. And yeah, we're hanging. We're talking about some the Black radical tradition, other Black philosophy. We're talking about politics. We're talking about what's happening right now in Minneapolis, and having a pretty interesting time doing it.
Right on. Thank you so much for subscribing to the Patreon. Keep spreading the word. Hope you're taking care of yourself, unpacking your thoughts. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Hope you're learning your lessons and sharing them with the world. Signing off, summer solstice, money, power, land, solidarity.
We need money, land, solidarity. If you funny, stand very far away from me. We have running plans about as far as they can see to keep them coming. Bands